Well, a pleasure to be speaking to you again, Professor James Tabor.
It's
Welcome back to History Valley.
good to see you too, Jacob. I always love coming on your show.
And for those that don't know, I'm going to be having a link in the description below to Derek's course called Creating Jesus, Why the Gospel of Mark Was Forgotten. And I really recommend that you go check this course out. James Tabor is going to be doing several episodes on there, giving a whole course about the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so I'm aware that the consensus of scholars is that Matthew and Luke both borrowed from Mark and Q, but not from each other. Although some scholars have asked the question, did Matthew and Luke borrow from the same version of Mark? Because some people will say that there were two different revisions of Mark in between the other two. But I know that that's a smaller group of scholars that claim that, but that movement does exist. So do you think they borrowed from the same version of Mark, or do you think it's possible that they could have been influenced by other revisions of Mark in between?
You know, it's worth a whole program, and it goes beyond the course. And in fact, you and I are we've been trying to schedule a program on some of that, and we
Yeah.
can do more detail. But briefly, I think the Mark we have is basically the one that we can work with and put in parallel form, and then see how Matthew and Luke both use Mark. I do hold to Mark being first, but rather than just using Mark, what I argue in this course is that Matthew and Luke are overriding and rewriting Mark because they're not happy at all with the Gospel of Mark. In other words, they are making use of Mark in terms of historian material. And I think it's generally agreed that there's that core story. But the way it comes across in Mark on a number of very key points to them, mainly how it starts and how it ends, is absolutely unsatisfactory because there's no birth of Jesus in Mark. And when you open Mark chapter 1, once the story starts and Jesus is introduced, in this course, I want you to pull Mark out of anything you would read or know from Matthew and Luke and just read Mark as Mark. You wouldn't even know for sure that Jesus is the main character. Just as Jesus came to be baptized by John. You know, maybe he'll disappear in chapter 2, which he doesn't, but I'm just saying it's good to take, I'm trying to get my students and people that would take this course to pull Mark out and read it as its own presentation. It's not a part of the synoptic problem. It's not a part of a question of priority. It's just what it is. And that's at least for the course. Of course, I'm like you, I'm interested in these other subsidiary questions of how everything finally developed. But I do think that Matthew and Luke have great problems with Mark, and they remove things that they feel are not part of the way they want to present what we could just call the Jesus story. So that's why I call it Creating Jesus, the course. Because with Mark, people have subsumed it to a very unimportant place. I don't mean scholars or people like you that have studied, but the general public. Everybody starts reading the New Testament. I did this as a kid, maybe you did. And you read Matthew, 28 chapters, it's kind of long, and you finally, and it's very familiar if you were raised in any kind of Christianity. And then you get to Mark, and I know when I read it, probably 10, 12 years old, I just thought, well, what is this? This is like, I've already read all this. It's all, because I'm not reading carefully, you know, but my general impression was it's just a subsidiary little summary maybe of Matthew's. So Matthew's where you go if you want to get the real stuff. And then maybe it's like the quick version, you know, if I don't have a lot of time. And then Luke is even fuller because even though he only has 24 chapters, he's got all this other material that Matthew doesn't have that we call L, you know, when we do the criticism. So what happens is Mark just gets lost. People don't even look at it. It's there, but they don't read it as Mark. Now, if it is, in fact, the first one, and if it's the first version of the Jesus story, And the author at least thought it could stand alone as a presentation. He clearly is intentionally not telling you about the birth or anything. He never even mentions Joseph. Somebody says, well, who is the father of Jesus? Or even, the husband of Mary. Never even mentioned. He didn't care about any of that. And at the end, you have the last verse, which is in the early manuscripts, that the women flee from the tomb and they say nothing to anyone. Well, that's not much of a gospel going forth to the world. Matthew's got this mountain scene with the Great Commission, and Luke has the disciples on the Mount of Olives as he ascends into heaven. So Mark is a kind of, I would call it a counter gospel. Like you go, well, what's the good news? And even when Jesus is asked in Mark, what do I do to have eternal life? I mean, you should get a good Christian answer here. And what does he say? Why are you calling me good? There's only one good God. It's like, where's the Christology? At least he could have said, well, believe in me and follow what I teach or something like that. So it really does stand out. I think the early Christians did not know what to do with it. They finally say, as you know, Papias and Irenaeus and others, oh, Mark was a friend of Peter and he was in Rome, and these are the memoirs of Peter. Well, I mean, there's just no evidence for that. We don't know who wrote Mark. It's anonymous. So I think in this course, you have the chance to go back and hear the first story before it became rewritten or even overwritten by anyone, and to ask yourself, what was it like? I would date it around the destruction of Jerusalem. What was it like for this particular author, at least in his community, to talk about following Jesus, whom they did follow? It's about Jesus. Starts out the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. But then it becomes almost a kind of counter narrative to what people are expecting. Jesus says, for example, I'm teaching in riddles so that people won't understand and be converted and saved. It's like, could you say that again? Because it sounded like you said that you didn't want people to get converted and saved. Or let's get away from this crowd because they want to hear what I teach, and I'm not here to teach them. This is not the Jesus that's going to get popular later with Christianity. And what he tells people to do, like Peter, remember, Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ in Mark chapter 8. It's major. Who am I? Elijah, prophet. Who are you? You're the Christ. And Jesus rebukes him and says, get behind me, Satan. Again. So I hope that will intrigue people a little bit, that you've got to take this gospel and you're going to learn a lot about the first and original presentation of the Jesus story. You've dealt on your channel with lots of people that have also provided some of the Hellenistic background to that story of Mark that I think is also very useful. We do a little bit of that, the divine man idea and so forth. And Mark is certainly aware of that. But if anything, I think he's presenting a tragedy and an anti-hero. And he's kind of nudging you as a potential follower and saying, yeah, come on, because we're all going to die on the cross together. Let's go. And so there's nothing, it ends with Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the last words of Jesus. Guess what? Luke takes it out. Luke is like, whoa, I don't need to. Matthew leaves it in, but he doesn't explain it. So anyway, I think there's some real value in studying Mark. I think people will be very intrigued with it. What we might do in the future, because you've delved a lot into the synoptic things, is after you have a time to look at the course and other people begin to take the course, we could maybe do a show in which we would delve into this a bit more by people that have been exposed to this idea that generally you do not hear. You know, when people say Mark's the first gospel, they're usually rejoicing about it in the sense that, like, wow, I love it, and it's so good, and aren't we glad we have it, and Matthew and Luke used it, and then we finally have Christianity developing. And I actually think that Mark, as a document, as it really exists, is not at all lending itself to that enterprise.
What do you make of some point out that there's a Q verse in Mark chapter 3 verse 22 about the Beelzebub material when Jesus is claimed to have healed in the name of Beelzebub, and this appears in Luke and Matthew a bit differently, but it's there. And this is also used in Q reconstructions. And the reason why I want to ask just real quick about this is there are some that postulate the three document hypothesis that Mark was familiar with Q or some earlier version of Q, maybe. And I wanted to see what you thought about that.
You know, within this kind of pond of early Christian tradition, you know, sloshing around, I think we do find these overlaps. And it could well be that Mark, when he writes, I'm going to put him in the 70s CE. And if Q was a collection of the sayings of Jesus, it could well be earlier than that. In its stripped down version, it seems to be much more along the lines of a Gospel of Thomas, you know, collection of the sayings of Jesus. Like, it doesn't have the crucifixion. It doesn't have really much of the story of Jesus at all. A few little individual stories, but that's about it. I think Mark might be aware of this, and I don't think he's trying to reinvent the wheel. Most of the Q material Mark would be fine with because it's radical following of Jesus, like giving up everything, hating your father, mother, brother, sister, you know, that kind of motif. That's not exactly quoted in Mark, but there's a similar idea of leaving everything behind. So I think he might have known of Q, even reflected some of Q, but he doesn't think Q is giving what he calls the gospel message. And he wants to give that. So we might even see his work as, okay, you've got a nice collection of the sayings, but what is the story of this guy? Like, who is he? Where did he come from? What did he really do? And he's willing to say that he's a miracle worker and he's an exorcist and he does many of the things that he does in Q, even though Q doesn't emphasize this as much as Mark. But he wants to put a shroud of mystery around it so that you still are left puzzled as to what to do, because the one thing Mark doesn't think anyone should do is what I would call the glory hallelujah, Christ is risen, let's all hook our chariots to Christ and we can all go to heaven when we die, which, you know, kind of becomes Jesus paid it all and that sort of thing. Whereas for Mark, I think he's concerned that people are going that way and not remembering what actually happened. And that is that Jesus was left dead and forsaken on a cross, and that his followers did not faithfully represent him or stick with him. And it's really a sad story at the end. It's very sad. The only way people can read it with any measure of comfort is to, in their head, hear the triumph, almost like, well, he didn't say it, but I believe it. But it's not in Mark. It's just not there.
And what would you recommend to readers, as a conclusion to this, what would you recommend to readers and viewers when they go through the Gospel of Mark and they try to get a better understanding of the historical Jesus by reading Mark as the first gospel?
Yeah, I think what I would really say, and it's not just trying to sell the course, although I want people to take the course, work through the course, because I think the answer will be there. But it's complex. It is an enigma. It is a mystery. It is a puzzle. And Mark presents it that way, and the disciples don't even get it. So if they don't even get it, you as the reader might have trouble getting it. But I think it's possible to figure it out because he gives enough hints. He even addresses his readers once. So he knows, he wants you to read it. But in terms of just the historical Jesus, I think it is the core story that many of us who work in the history of religion accept in its most basic elements. You know, if you take E.P. Sanders and Paula Friedrichsen and Dale Allison and Bart Ehrman, and you try to put together kind of the minimal bio of Jesus, like he's from the Galilee and he comes down to Jerusalem and he's an exorcist and a healer, and that's primarily coming from Mark, and that's the kind of general historical framework that predominates in the academy. You know, if you strip Jesus down to give me the 10 points of his bio, you would end up with the things that are in Mark. Now, there are people that deconstruct that and would question the historicity of that, like our friend Dr. Price and McDonnell and others, that even that could be a literary creation. And I'm not in this course dealing with that historical issue as much as if you went to a play or a drama and watched this performed, curtains up, curtains down, a 3-act play or a movie, what would be the artistic message of that presentation? And then you could ask as a secondary question, was any of that history? And I would leave it open. So the course, it's almost like get to know the story and then you can talk more about the historicity. And that was the mistake Jacob made in the 1830s, is as scholars began to decide Mark had priority, they also made the assumption, well, then it's almost like reading pure history then. And Derek has this other course by Dale Allison on the quest for the historical Jesus, where Allison points that out, that by the 50s, people are beginning to say, well, wait a minute. You know, it started with Bultmann and others, that just because Mark presents a story that we could outline as history doesn't mean it's history necessarily. We still have a question. And then you've got the new quest and the third quest and all this other stuff over the past 50 years. But first step is just work on Mark in a way that I can help you do in the course by pulling it away and really emptying your mind of assumptions and see what's really there. And it's a kind of a thrilling study. I think it really is.
Well, thanks for your time, Professor Tabor.
Thanks, Jacob.
And I'd like to remind viewers, the link to the course is in the description below. Go check it out. Really recommend that you all do. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.